waiting.
I hope all of you had good lunch. Right. Are you seeing my slide deck?
Yes.
You hear me fine. Okay. All right. Right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here and talk this afternoon. My name is Parinita Mulak, and I'm a software developer in the applications team under Joshua Gomez. I'll be talking about the modern tools we use to build the library website, specifically the component library and the Nux site. I have a lot of code features to show, so let's get started. So in the Asha slides, you must have seen the components in the design system. And I took some screenshots from the storybook of the components that we have built in the component library. So what is a component library? It is really what it sounds like. It is a library of pre-built UI components like a nav bar, site brand, banners, header, footer, search, and featured items, and many more that can be shared across different projects that take in the similar design systems. The next diagram is shows how we build a component library and publish it to NPM in our GitHub workflow. We built it in the summer of 2021. At that time, Vue documentation recommended the Vue SFC rollup package to scaffold the Vue component library. And unfortunately, this is deprecated now. And looking back, I think I should have just used Vue CLI to build this library in Vue 2. And for Vue 3, if anybody's using Vue 3, you guys can just use Vite. So a commonly used tool for bundling Vue component is Rollup. It's a JavaScript module bundler, and it compiles the Vue components into different formats to use in ES, CommonJS, or directly in the browser. When we merge something to the main branch in GitHub Action, when we merge something to the main branch, the GitHub Action runs a job to publish to NPM, which calls the rollup command. This is the npm run build command, and to build files using the rollup config. If no format is specified, it will create files like the CommonJS, ES module, and the minified JavaScript files. Okay, now let's walk through the component library. This is a GitHub repo. It's named the UCLA-library-website components. Here I've opened the package.json file. This file is a configuration file used in the Node.js projects to manage dependencies. Can you guys see this, or should I bump it up?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay, yeah.
That's good.
All right, so this is where we add the project dependencies, scripts, and other project metadata. This is the name of our package, UCLA-library-website component. We are on version 2.37.2. We use semantic versioning, just like the design tokens. And these are the scripts that I used during the build phase. And locally, when we are running the local server or storybook or field linting. And we have also run the build scripts during the GitHub Action phase, the GitHub Action process that I showed you in the previous slide. And this is the way you can pass in different formats to generate different format files. But in our current workflow, we just call npm run build, and it just builds all the files for us. And we have also configured Storybook and installed Cypress to run to do component testing. But I think we will cover that in future talks. Here we have some more configuration here. I'm specifying, so these files that get generated from in the build phase are added to the dist directory, and the legacy bundlers and Node.js will use the main file, which is the CommonJS file. And if there are modern bundlers in other projects will use the module build. And this specifies the entry point file for the browser environment. I am using the same ESM. file for it. And unpackage is that specifies the entry point file for the unpackaged CDN service when importing the package in the browser. And the files are defines an array of files and directories that should be included when the package is published. Next, let's look at the view config file. So this component library is built using Vue 2. And because that time, that library Vue SFC rollup was using Vue 2 and Nux 2, and we have built the site in Nux 2, so automatically that was a choice to use that type. And Vue config.js file, this configuration file allows developers to customize various aspects of the Vue CLI build process, such as CSS handling, linting, and the Webpack configuration. Here we have lint on save flag. What this does is it just determines whether linting should be applied during the development process. Then CSS is for customizing CSS related options. We have loader options such as the CSS loader. And for that, we're using Sass as the preprocessor. Asha showed like those Sass partials and Sass files in the design token package. So we are importing here as additional data so that they can be injected before every Sass file compilation. And we have also added PostCSS as another loader, and we have specified some plugins. We added this plugin because we wanted to handle external SVG files when used as background images in our Sass files. And down here we have chain Webpack. What we are doing here is we are removing the default SVG rule from Webpack configuration. And then below here, we are adding a new rule for SVG files, and we are adding a loader, which is specific to Vue, the Vue SVG loader, which takes in some options, and we are using the SVG optimizer. The reason we did this was there was issue with scaling SVGs when we were applying CSS, and it was recommended that we disable remove view box here. So this is the configuration for in Vue. Next, let's look at the source directory, which has the lib component folder, which is all the Vue components we've built till now. I'm just going to close these two. All right. So this has all the Vue components we've built so far. It's like more than 100 components in here. And in this component directory, we have index.js file, just somewhere down here. Sorry for scrolling. So yeah, so this is where we are importing all the default Vue components and exporting the default as named components. This is a shorthand for importing and exporting components in one statement. And we have exported all the components in this file. And outside of this the component folder, we have an entry file, which is either entry assemble.js or entry.js for rollup. And this. So in this file, we are exporting a set of Vue components and defining an install function for installing the components in a Vue application, or it can be used in Next application also. So here we are importing all the components from the components folder from the index file that I just showed you, and assigns them to the components object. And here we are installing, this is an install function. Here each component is registered globally with using the Vue.component method. And this function is executed, like this whole function is executed when it is added to Vue.use in a Vue application or in a Next plugin that I'll show later. And down here, we are exporting this install function so that is available in other projects when we add this component library package, and it's used by this syntax. And down here, we can individually export components instead of as a library, and the syntax is just using export star, and it allows users to import and register each component. So this is used by rollup. So talking of rollup, let's look at the rollup.config file. So under the root of this component library, we have a build directory, and that's where our rollup.config.js file is. Now, first, in this file, we are first importing all the dependencies and plugins using the ES module syntax. And next here, it reads the browser list RC file. This is what it looks like. So when we add a browser RC list file, we ensure that the project CSS and JavaScript are automatically processed and transpiled to be compatible with a specific range of browsers and environments. And here specifically, we've specified current node, which refers to the current version of the Node.js runtime environment, and last two versions represents the last two versions of all major browsers, and greater than 2% specifies that the project should support browsers that have more than 2% of global usage. And finally, we have IE greater than 10 indicates that the project should be compatible with Internet Explorer versions greater than 10. Let's close this. So we are reading this file, and it will be used by the ES build target. And because it's being used by the ES build target, it doesn't support IE, so we are filtering down here IE. In the next line, we are extracting the Babel preset env config. Right now, we haven't set any configuration for Babel. It's empty in our file, so it really doesn't do much. It just takes the defaults. And in the next line, we are fetching the command line arguments that you pass to npm run build command. If you want a specific format, that is captured in here. And in the next line, we're just creating a project root instance variable by assigning the value of a resolved absolute path of the parent directory of the current file. And on line 32, we are initializing a base config object. Now, this is what contains the common configuration options for all build formats. It specifies the input file, plugins, and other settings related to pre-processing, post-processing, and transpiling. Asha has done a lot of magic in here. She is very familiar with Sass and Webpack and Rollup. So yeah, and this was a great help for the project. And coming down here, we have defined another constant external. Now this has an array. It has an array of external dependencies used in the project. So here we have specified view as an external dependency because that way view will not be bundled in this component library package. And the next line we have output globals. The globals object defines the global variable name that replaces the external imports. Now, this is useful for libraries or frameworks that rely on global variables. Some of the examples are jQuery $, and for view, we use view, capital view, VUE. So, and here, down here, we're customizing the configs based on the targets that we had specified to the npm run build command. And each target takes in the base config that was defined on the top, and also updates the input, output, and plugins required for building the specific format and version of the library. Now, before we wrap up the component library code, I would like to show a component that uses the Vuex mock data. In Nuxt, we have a Vuex store, which fetches the global data from Craft CMS, and some of these components uses this Vuex store state to fetch the data from like header and footer links. The Vuex store we defined in this library only has mock data, which is assigned to the Vuex state. So what is Vuex? Well, Vuex is a state management pattern and a library for Vue.js application. And it is where if you have to create a store folder and then add the files to it. So let's open it. Close this one. All right. So I've opened the index.js file. This is a store, and it creates the Vuex instance in this file, and it's defined under, it's added to the store directory. So here we are in the index.js, this line, we are installing the Vuex plugin, which is a package that has been installed using npm, and we are enabling this as a Vuex store functionality for this whole component library. Now, here we have mock data. As I mentioned to you, we are not really doing any, we are not sending queries to Craft CMS to fetch data. We are just creating mock data here. So these are the header links that we have created for our storybook. And down here, we are exporting the instance of UX store, and it accepts some properties. And one of the properties is modules. So modules allows you to define UX store into smaller manageable modules, and each module represents a separate piece of application state. So each module will have the state, the getters, the mutations, the actions. And I will show one example of FooterSock, which has all that. And here we have also, so some of the modules that we have defined as footer primary, FooterSock, and footer sponsor, they all have mock data that add that mock data to state. And state is where we're adding the header data that is defined on top here as mock. And this represents the initial state of the store. And down here, getters, mutations, and actions are empty because this is a mock Vuex store. Actions are similar to mutations, but they are asynchronous and can contain business logic and perform asynchronous operations. Actions are responsible for committing mutations to update the state. So actions call mutations and mutations call the state, update the state. And getter are functions that allow you to access Vuex store state properties from the store. So this is what we call in the state properties in our components. For the example of FooterSock, we have, this is a module, and this is the mock data that we have defined. This is the FooterSock links, which replicate what is in Craft CMS. And here we are just using the state and assigning that mock data as the store representation. Now let's go over the FooterSock component. I want to show you the component in Storybook. So this is what the FooterSock component looks like in Storybook. We don't have many variations of it. And these are the links that are coming from the mock Vuex store instead of the Craft CMS. We're just making sure that the component works in isolation from Nuxt. And so this is the actual component. This is a Vue component. It's a Vue2 component. It's a single file format component. And we are using the options API in Vue2 and template, just to give an idea of what a Vue component is. It has template, scripts, and styles. So template defines the structure and the layout of a component. It uses Vue's template syntax to bind data and render dynamic content. It consists of HTML markup, then Vue directives and dynamic binding. Then script down here is the section contains the component logic and behavior. It defines the component's name, then any imports necessary dependencies, and declares the component's props. Here we haven't declared any props, but generally most of the components need props. And computed properties, we have computed properties for this, and no methods in this component. And props, let me show an example of props actually. So go to maybe the card meta. So this one has props, and the prop section defines the input properties that the component expects to receive from its parent component. And each prop has like a type defined, like string, array, boolean. This is one way. This is one of the very nice features of Vue. This is the one-way data binding, where the data is passed from the page to the component, or the parent component passes data to the child component. Then computed properties are reactive properties that are derived based on the component's data and prop. and they are computed on demand and update automatically when their dependencies change. Next section is the style section, contains the component scope styles written in Sass. Scope CSS is a feature provided by Vue.js that allows you to encapsulate styles within a component, preventing them from affecting other components or elements outside of the component scope. It helps to avoid conflicts and unintended overrides between different components. Footer sock template renders, going back to the template, footer sock renders the footer links using Vue directives like v-for, and it's calling the computed property, parse sock items, and down here, this is what is returning the store state. Once it's added to the Nuxt, in the Nuxt site, the actual data from Craft is then shown on the component, the footer links. Let's see. I think that's all for this one. I want to show you how this component library is used in the Nuxt repo, but before that, let's look at what is Nuxt. Nuxt is an intuitive web framework based on the official Vue.js libraries, Node.js, and powerful development tools such as Webpack, Babel, and PostCSS. Nuxt.js comes pre-configured with Vuex, Vue Router, and Vue Meta. With Nuxt.js, you can build static site, single page applications, and server-side rendered applications, and you can easily change from one to another with a single command. Right. So now that we had a component library created and it's packaged in NPM, we install it in Nuxt by just using npm install the name of the component library and -d, which saves it to the dev dependency. This is our the Nuxt repo, the library website Nuxt repo. So let's take a look at it. I've opened the package.json file. So yeah, before that, let me show how to connect this component library. If you're working on this component library before we make those changes available to npm, we want to test whether that change works with the Nuxt repo. So we have Nuxt repo running on your machine and the component library code running on your machine, and you will run, once you make a change to the components, you would do a build that will generate all the files needed to be used by the Nuxt repo, and you simply call npm link, and that adds this component library to the npm global package on your local machine, and then you can consume that on the library website Nuxt project by just using npm link and the name of our package, and call npm run dev, which runs the Nuxt dev server, and check whether the components are working the way as expected on the pages. Going back to the package.json file. Actually, before I go, sorry, I need to look at the other slides first. So here, this is a build phase in GitHub Action. It runs when a PR is merged to the main branch. Here you can see we have the SSG build, which is the static site generator, and which crawls all the Nuxt routes and the dynamic routes on all the pages in the code. And we pull the content from Craft CMS and index that data to Elasticsearch. After this build, we have the end-to-end test step, which runs the Cypress test and pushes the Percy screenshots and automatically approves the Percy checks. The last step is to deploy the dist directory that was generated by the SSG build to Netlify production site. And in the next diagram, I'm showing the request time of in the browser. Here, when the page is loaded in the browser, the JavaScript and the assets and the HTML is fetched from the Netlify CDN, and then JavaScript executes and hydrates the page that is, the page becomes reactive. And because we are just loading static pages, the site is very fast. The site search and the filter pages fetch real-time data from Elasticsearch on the client side. And also we have the event detail page where if there is an event registration button, we use proxy service that the services team built to fetch the form and register the event. And all this happens on the client side. So these two features are on the client side. Right. Now I can actually look at the code. This is the name of our repo. The scripts, I just want to show you the component library and the scripts here. So Nux has several scripts that we can use to run, and one of them is the dev, which runs the dev server, and generate is used to generate which triggers the static site generation, and start is used to showcase those files. It acts as HTTP server, and it uses the files that are generated by the generate or build command. Build is, in our current project, we have not been using build at all because build is used for server-side rendering and universal mode. And we also have Cypress in this repo because we have written end-to-end tests. And who's Amy? And we also have linter set up for the code. Now, yeah, these are the dependencies, and in the dev dependencies is where we've added the component library, and this is the version it is on. And Asha showed the design tokens that are added to this code too. Next, let's look at the Nuxt config. Just like Vue config, Nuxt also has a config file. It is a single point of configuration for Nuxt. If you want to add modules or override default settings, this is the place to apply the changes. And we have made some customization. Some of the things that if you're building a static site, you will set target to static, then you will set components to true. We are using Nuxt to when it doesn't auto import components. So by specifying components as to true, it automatically imports components and we don't have to register them on the Nuxt pages. And here runtime config has a built-in .env support for better security and faster development. If you have a .env file in your project root directory, it will be automatically loaded into process.env and accessible within your Nuxt config. So public runtime should hold all the environment variables that are public, as well as these will be exposed on the front end. And private runtime config should hold all the environment variables that are private and that should not be exposed on the front end. And we have added the Elasticsearch write key to this private runtime config. Next, I want to show you, we have added some configuration for the meta tags, and we've added some global SCSS files so that they are available on each page here, and similarly for other styles. Plugins are Nuxt plugins. These are very powerful. They run either on the client side or on the server side or both. And I'm going to show how we have used plugins for fetching Elasticsearch data and for indexing. Then we are using Axios and GraphQL. Axios for making REST API calls, and we are using the proxy service here, and the base URLs are set up over here. And GraphQL is, this is the GraphQL client, and we are using the Nuxt GraphQL request package, and we are specifying the endpoint, which is Craft, and we query the GraphQL API from Craft. Down here, we have this property is used by the static site generator, and if you use exclude, then you can exclude certain routes or certain pages from your build, and those will not get added to the static. Those pages will not be generated as static. Then we also have, Nuxt also has modules, which lets you extend the core functionality of Nuxt. And specifically, we have written build modules for creating a temporary index in Elasticsearch and to swap those index in Alias in Elasticsearch. Down here, we have another build option for Webpack, and we are just creating the similar rules we created in Vue config. We have similar rules here for SVG in Nuxt config to support different kinds of SVGs. Okay, that's all for the Nuxt config file. Now I want to show you a listing page that we have built in Nuxt. So this is the programs listing page, and we have implemented Elasticsearch filters on this listing page. And so here, if the user enters any keyword or selects the Elasticsearch aggregated data, so let me open the network tab. And if you select one of these, the facet data or the aggregated data here and filter the programs, it makes a call to Elasticsearch and fetches the data. So this is the data that is pulled from Elasticsearch. It's got 8 records. Not sure if you guys can see this, but it returns some data from Elasticsearch Live on our library website. So let's look at the code. So pages is the folder where we add our routes and pages, or specifically Nuxt pages. And this is the program listing page. And here in the template section, we are assembling all the components from the component library. So these components are all coming from the component library. We don't have a components folder in Nuxt. All our components are coming from the component library. And so here, so how does a Nuxt page know about these components? So we have actually installed them using npm install, and it's available in our packaged .json file. And then we have added a Nuxt plugin where the magic happens. So let's look at that. So this is the plugin, add library website view component. Here we are importing Vue. We're importing the install function that we wrote in the UCL library website component. We had exported it in the entry file, and that is what we are importing here. And then when we pass it to vue.use, it becomes available to the Nuxt pages and the Nuxt application. And we don't have to register because we are auto importing it. Next, in this template, there is a search generic component, and to which we pass the filters. And in this case, we are passing only one filter. In the program listing that I showed you, we are just using one filter, name type, and users can select like multiple values under it to filter the program list on the page. Now let's look at how this filter data is fetched from Elasticsearch. For that, again, we wrote a Nuxt plugin. Nuxt plugin is great for injecting methods like that, functions which can talk to like third-party APIs. So you bring that up. But before that, let me show. So the filters are called in the async mounted method in the program listing page. And this is a Vue lifecycle function. And when this is executed, it calls this method set filters. And this is where we are calling the injected function from a Nuxt plugin. And that plugin name is defined as $data API. So let's look at that function in the plugin. So apart from like installing a component library or a Vue plugin, plugins are also used to talk to third-party APIs and to inject different functions. And a plugin function accepts a Nuxt context and it also accepts, it passes an inject method. And that is used in this case over here in the inject method, we are passing the get aggregations method, which is getting the aggregated data from Elasticsearch. And this is the code in the get aggregations function. It is an async function because we're making a fetch call to Elasticsearch API, and is responsible for fetching the aggregations based on the fields and section handle. It accepts headers. We are just using the read key over here of Elasticsearch, and we are expecting the content to be JSON, and we're making a post request to the query, and we're passing the query DSL in the body of this method. And down here we are making Elasticsearch has different queries, and here we're specifically using a match query on the section handle that we're passing. In this case, we want to get only the entries for program, and for those program, we want to get the type data, the aggregated type data. So that is coming from here. This it just transforms the field into desired format for the query. And then the data is received, and it is then sent to the search generic component. So let's go back to the template. Now here, the search generic component also accepts some more props, like the placeholder, which is the default text for the text field, and the search generic query. It's the data from the URL query parameters. And this is important here. So when the user performs a search and a form is submitted from this component search generic, an event is emitted. So that event is named search ready, and that is listened over here in the parent component. And this triggers this method, get search data method. This is just a view method in the options API that we have defined. And let's look at that method, what it does. So here we are calling the view router. So as I had mentioned, it next comes packaged with the Vuex and view router and view meta. So we can use the router to update. There's some routes like on the pages as needed. And so here specifically, we're calling the push method, and to refresh the current route, so the route stays the same, and then the new filter query data is passed. So that becomes, then you can bookmark this static page with the filters that are selected. Once this is done, we have set up a watch query, and in the same code, we have a watch query which listens to the route.query that we just updated in the get search data. And if the query is updated, then it calls the next fetch method. Next has two ways to fetch data, recommends two ways to fetch data. One, either you can use the async data or the fetch. The fetch is, we have set it to work on not on server side and just on the client side. So this gets called only on the client side when somebody loads the page, a bookmark page where the query is changed or something similar action has happened. And this is what the next async fetch method is defined as. We are checking for certain query parameters exist or not, and if this filters are set, certain filters are set, and then once we have all that data, then we call the same data API Next plugin where we have defined our Elasticsearch queries, and we have another method injected, keyword search with filters, which is called, and what this does is that it just returns it makes a query to Elasticsearch API endpoint, and then returns a JSON object, which is then assigned to the Next data. And so we are assigning to some, these are some of the Next data variables that we are setting after we get the results from Elasticsearch, and this data gets merged with the data on the page, and then the required computed properties are executed due to reactivity, and the page template gets updated, and we see the filter list. Now let's look at, this is the search and the filter part of Elasticsearch. Let's see how we index data that we are fetching from Craft CMS, and we fetch data from Craft CMS using GraphQL, and then that data is passed on to Elasticsearch to be indexed. So we open a detail page. So for program listings, we also have a program detail page for individual programs. And this is a dynamic page in Nuxt, and this is how we define the dynamic page in Nuxt. It's underscore some name. In this case, we're using slug. And so let's look at the script. Let's look at the script portion of this component and see how the data is fetched using GraphQL query from Craft CMS. We are importing the GraphQL query from the GQL folder, and we're passing it to an async data, which runs on the server side or during the static site generation. And we are passing the specific, since this is a detail page, it has a slug from the params option, and we pass this to Craft to get that resource back. So let's look at the GraphQL folder, where we have defined our queries and fragments. So under GraphQL folder here, we have fragments and queries. And before I jump into like specifically GraphQL, I'm not sure how many of you know about GraphQL. So GraphQL and REST are two different approaches for designing and consuming APIs. REST is an architectural style for building APIs that is based on the principles of the web. GraphQL is a query language and runtime for APIs that was developed by Facebook. So with GraphQL, you can create fragments and queries. Fragments have all the parts of the queries which can be reused in multiple page queries. And this is an example of a fragment. In this case, it's an image fragment. And this is a reusable piece of query syntax that allows you to define a set of fields that can be included in multiple queries. Now let's see how this is used in the program detail query. So here we are importing that image fragment, and this fetches a specific program from Craft based on the slug that we are passing, and the section handle is program. So Craft has a specific sections, and they have section handles, and one of the examples is program. And the image fragment is used within this hero image block, and it fetches the image assets for us to be used on the pages. And the rest of the fields we are requesting are also needed to show on the page, and they are fetched using the GraphQL client that we are using in the async data function. So let's go back to the async data function. So here, once we receive data from GraphQL, from GraphQL API from Craft, we check that if the data exists. If the data doesn't exist, then we show an error page. This error page has a layout which is added to the layouts directory. We have a default layout, we have an error layout, and we have a custom layout. So default layout is used pretty much on all sites, on all the site pages. And we had a need to create a custom layout specifically for impact project, and the impact report pages are using the impact layout. In the layout, you can change what header and footer you want to use for several pages combined, and for impact, we are using a different kind of like a reduced form of header compared to the other pages on the library site. After this, I've shown you how to index, and yeah, so once we have the data from Craft, and this is where we are indexing the data to the Elasticsearch. And for that, we have written the Elasticsearch plugin. Shout out to Ashton. She wrote this. Let's look at that. So this is again a Nux plugin, and the function index is what is injected on the pages. And once this is invoked, it checks whether this function is running on the server side. That means, is it running during the build phase or the static site generation, or on the server side? In our case, it's the static site generation is what we care. And we check whether the node environment, we didn't want it to do any kind of indexing in our development environment. So only if it runs the static site generation, we wanted to index this data, and we check if the data exists, and from Craft, and the slug is used as the Elasticsearch document ID. And here we are getting the temporary index, which I'll show later how that's created using modules. And once all these conditions are set to true, then we send the GraphQL document that we received from Craft to Elasticsearch to be indexed by using _doc and the ID endpoint for Elasticsearch REST API. And here we are passing in the headers the right key, because we are writing to, and we are using the private runtime key over here for indexing. And if the data is successful, then we can search this content on the site. I think finally, I just want to show how we built the temporary index and how we are using the Elasticsearch alias. So this is the diagram that depicts what happens during the SSG build. We run npm run generate which builds the static pages, and Nux generate class gives a way to customize this build process. Generate before is a Nux hook that is extended in this module. We wrote this build Nux module, and this is where we are creating the temporary index for every build. So every time a build runs in any environment, we have a new temporary index. And once that is successfully created using the REST API call, we add that temporary name to the public runtime config so that it is available to all the other pages or other Nux plugins or modules that we need. Now, once that is done, the next hook that is invoked is the generate page. And here Nux crawls, Nux has an inbuilt crawler, which crawls all the links on all the pages from the pages folder, and generates routes, dynamic routes, and fetches data from Craft and indexes this content in the temporary index and that we created for this build. And last, we have another module, Last, we have another module which extends the generate done, which another hook which gets called at the end of the static site generation. We have all the static pages that generate in the dist folder. Here we are swapping the indices in the alias. Alias is a feature of Elasticsearch. In this module, we make the Elasticsearch REST API call to alias endpoint and perform two actions. One, to remove all the indices, and from the current alias, and next and the second action is to add this new temporary index that we created to the alias when performing the site search. And so this alias, the Elasticsearch alias, is what is used on the site search and filters on the static pages. So this wraps up the Elasticsearch code, yeah, this wraps up my talk also. So thank you, and I hope this is helpful for when you build a Vue application or a Vue component library, or if you're working with Elasticsearch and Nux. So yeah, reach out to me or anyone on our team if you have any questions.
Thank you. That was a lot. Anyone got questions? one online, can you check the chat? Are there any?
Okay, I don't see anything in chat.
Okay. And I guess that's it. Thank you, Karanita. All right. Chad, you're up next. You can use this machine? Okay, great.
That's fun. I know.
I have to wait for Josh.
Okay. What do I need to do to get it?
Cause we having.
This world. Just.
It's a whole bit too big.
That's it. Cause ours is like. Like start to increase.
You do that.
Stop the recording. Yeah. And it's very, or marked down, you do this, that can do that, and now it's a problem. We all.
Oh, no, not.
Rely on this one.
Yeah.
Oh, could you
Now,
go?
sorry.
I forget. That's it.
Oh, we were curious, like some of the bottom end.
Oh, thank you.
Like,
No, that was first.
is that right?
Yeah.
And I assume it's a wrapper on. Or no.